Hi guys, welcome back. This week I'm going to be doing a new World War I figure for you. Now I thought I would do a German this time, which is something I have never done for you before from that era. And another thing that I've never done before is painted a pilot. Now that makes a certain amount of sense because they just don't figure very much into tabletop wargaming because they're up in their airplanes. You know, you paint the airplane, you're done. However, I'm going to be doing a pilot for you. And the other thing this figure is going to be is a specific historical character, which is, again, something I don't think I've ever covered, painting a figure that's supposed to be one particular person. So you can probably figure out where this is going. It's a World War I German, a pilot, and a specific person. So, you know, who could that be? It's, of course, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. It's a figure which has been produced by Scarab miniatures, so that's also new in some ways because I don't think I've ever done anything from them before. It's actually part of a small vignette. It includes him, one of his friends, and his pet dog. However, at this point, I'm only going to be painting von Richthofen for you. And you can see him here. He's just in a very neutral pose in his classic sort of German military uniform, wearing a sort of a shearling flight jacket over top. So, from a painting perspective, I think this tutorial will be interesting because we're going to look a little bit at, you know, how do you go about that? How do you, you have a specific person, a specific likeness you want to capture. Is that even possible in 28mm? You know, is there anything you can do? Well, we're going to find out, or at least I'm going to try. Let's put it like that. And I'm not saying that it'll necessarily be successful. I don't know. I've never attempted anything like this, but I wanted to see, you know, at this scale, can you do anything to influence sort of the look of the figure in a particular direction? The other thing that will be interesting about this figure is he's wearing a lot of leather, probably more leather than I've ever painted. He's got on a shearling jacket, so that's kind of a worn brown leather, usually with that sort of white fleece lining, sort of, that was typical of pilots for a long period in the early 20th century. So this should be really interesting if you're looking for how to paint like big leather pieces of clothing, which is something I've never covered and will probably be useful for a lot of other eras and on a lot of other figures. So let's see, I think that's about it. So why don't we go ahead and get started on painting the infamous Red Baron. Alright, so here's a photo of the actual Red Baron from Wikipedia, so you can get some sense of what I'm kind of working with here. Now you can see right away when you look at this figure that I've been messing with the face. There's some paint scraped off, and the reason for that is I looked at the sculpt and there was some weird bulging and things going on with the cheek sculpt and the around the nose that I didn't really like, so I kind of scraped that down to try to get it to look a little bit more like the figure. And now I'm just going to apply a base coat of a cork brown, like I always do on pretty much every figure when I'm working on the skin tone, so no real difference there. And then also, like I do on pretty much every figure, I am going to apply a really heavy wash of Reichland Flesh Shade just to help define the recesses and shadows on the face. Now, anytime I think you're trying to recreate an actual likeness, insofar as that's possible, you need to consider just what's actually possible with paint. Ultimately, you're still going to be very dependent on the sculpting to convey the likeness, and there's only so many things that you can add, I guess, with paint to sort of influence the appearance beyond that. The sculpt in this figure, I don't think it was particularly good. I don't think it was a particularly good likeness, really, of the Red Baron. It was a little bit crude, so that makes my job a little bit harder here, but I'm doing my best. I've started out here with a mixture of the cork brown and some Iraqi sand, as I often do. And so I've kind of identified the things that I think I can probably do to nudge it more towards looking like the Red Baron just using paint. One of those is, if you saw his picture, he had a very round, full face. He didn't have sculpted cheekbones. It was a very smooth, round kind of oval face. So I'm being very careful when I paint the cheeks and chin on this figure to really make sure they transition into one sort of smooth whole. I'm not going to put dramatic shadows kind of underneath the tops of his cheekbones. I'm really working on a round, kind of smooth looking effect here. Normally I would go on to a shadow fine lining step now, but I'm putting on a sort of a second coat with a bit more Iraqi sand mixed into the cork brown. Normally I wouldn't do this, but again, because it's a likeness and I want more subtlety and sort of fine detail, and the face is really important. That is why I'm kind of building in this extra highlight layer. And with that done now, I am going to go ahead and take Vallejo Black Red and use it to fine line really deep shadows on the face. So that's going to be around the eyes. Because he's wearing his cap, he's got it pulled down pretty low over his eyes. You're not going to have much detail to worry about there. You're going to really want to paint all of that in the shadow. And then otherwise, I'm lining around sort of the bottom underneath the shadow under his hat, and of course around under his nose and lips. One thing I'm doing with this paint, which I think probably influences the look of the figure, is the Red Baron. I think he has a pretty, not a very large, a reasonably, size, very symmetrical nose from his picture, and the sculpt did not. It had kind of a big, weird, lopsided nose. You can correct that to an extent on figures by sort of lining not just underneath, but then putting some of the dark red shadow up to both the right and left side, and that'll help make it look smaller. And if you've got a lopsided nose, you just make the red line on one side sort of thicker to compensate for that and try to even it out, make it more symmetrical. And that red is really too stark a shadow for the sides of the nose, but if you put it on now, you can then layer your highlight colors over top of that, and that'll tone it down quite a bit, but at the same time it'll help build up that idea that it's just darker there and help sort of balance out the shape of the nose. And I'm also using, again, another thing I can influence a bit with paint is the shape of his lips. And I'm spending a lot of time on that too, because you can, again, use that black red to really adjust more kind of the size and shape of his lips beyond what's sculpted onto the model. Now I'm just using pure Iraqi sand as a highlight, and you can see I'm really again emphasizing those cheeks. I'm trying to continue to emphasize that sort of more round, full look on the figure's face, that they're very smooth and blended into the chin, and not a lot of like hard shadows or definition there. I want that to be smooth and fairly soft looking particularly for a male sculpt. And you can see, of course, I'm also highlighting the nose, his upper lip, his bottom lip, and his ears and the back of his neck as well. Now I've moved on to a highlight where I mix white into my Iraqi sand to lighten it up. And again, I'm building that up on the tops of his cheeks, blending it out. At this point, I don't have too much white in the mix. From what I could see, the Red Baron or Manfred von Richthofen he had a pretty fair complexion. He was pretty light skinned, so I don't feel too bad about getting fairly pale highlights on this figure, because I think it would fit with his skin type, basically. But again, you can see I'm really emphasizing the lips, the chin, and the nose in particular, and the tops of the ears. You want to be a little bit more careful not to overdo this on the cheeks, because it'll end up being a little bit too washed out. I go back in with some darker colors like the Iraqi sand and even the cork brown in some places, and sort of tone back and sort of refine as I go along areas where I think I've gotten a little bit too much light on, kind of smooth those in. I finish off by adding even more white into my Iraqi sand, so I have a very pale color, and I'm going to use that really, as on all figures, to really emphasize the tops of the cheekbones, the lips, and the nose really strongly with very, very small light highlights. Even though he does have a fairly full, round, smooth face and cheeks, he has a fairly attractive, handsome face, and there are some nice sharp angles. It's not just really a baby face exactly. So I want to make sure that I do build up, definitely some, more stark eye shadows, to help, also it'll make him look a little more like a guy, because if you're too soft in your shading on faces, it also tends to give the face a little bit more of a female appearance. Now I'm going to move on to working on the leather jacket. I'm reasonably happy with how the face looks. It could be better, it could be worse, but we'll talk about that more later at the end of the video. Anyway, I'm working the jacket. So this is going to be a very sort of dark, worn leather. So I'm applying a base coat here of German camouflage black-brown. My first highlight now is going to be chocolate brown. I'm applying it quite thinly. I want to keep the paint transparent so that a lot of that really black brown still sort of comes through. So I'm applying it thinly, emphasizing all the folds, creases, sort of highlights in the leather, pretty much all of them here at this point. Just everywhere that's not down in a sharp crease or fold or a shadow area, but pretty much everywhere else is going to get that attention. And I'm going to go over it all once, and then I'm going to go back in and build the layer up again on areas where I want it to be brighter and a higher amount of highlight, pretty much like I'll always do. Right now, I can tell you, you're always with leather coats like this particularly, you're always going to put, besides highlighting areas where light is hitting, and creases and stuff, you also want to think about highlighting the edges of the pieces of fabric. So around the bottom, around his sleeve cuffs, along the edge where it buttons up, around the top of his collar, anywhere where there's a seam in the leather, you want to build up brighter color towards those and then sort of blend out into darker color. I have now mixed some cork brown, I already had it out, handy, huh, into my chocolate brown. Not too much, I'm keeping it subtle here, and I'm going to just continue that same highlighting process I already started. As always, I start out first by lightening from the edges of all of the pieces of fabric going inwards. So that's the first step, and then I'm going to go back over and pick out light areas where light's hitting the tops of creases and things like that, sort of as a secondary step. And again, you're working with layers here, so building up the brown paint as needed to get it higher, but leaving a lot of areas quite thin, so there's a lot of transparency, and that really dark brown black color still kind of glows through. Next, I'm going to apply a wash of Nuln Oil. I'm going to be a little bit careful about this. I'm going to really focus, as you can see, down in really shadowed, deep areas like under his arms, between his arms, sort of underneath the edge of his coat, you know, just where you really expect there to be a lot of darkness. But I'm going to kind of apply it lightly everywhere, and this will help sort of with the overall look of kind of this dark leather with this sort of really dark color down in the folds. Once that's dry, I'm going to continue highlighting again in the same way that I sort of did before. I'm using that same chocolate brown, but now with even more cork brown mixed into it, so it's even lighter, but not too big a step again. And I'm just doing what I did before, going back over and re-emphasizing areas where light would be hitting the tops of creases, and of course, again, as I said, really paying attention to lighten at the edges of all pieces of fabric or leather in this coat and sort of blend out from there. And by that I would also include his elbows. It's also really, it's not just the edges of the fabrics, but also probably any area where you would expect there to really be extreme wear on the fabric as well. Once that's done, we'll just mix in even more of the cork brown, and you can kind of see a pattern here. I'm kind of building on that. And I'm going to start, by this point, I don't really want to highlight most areas of the coat anymore. I'm really now pretty much only interested in those sort of edge seam areas. So I'm now applying this, from this point on, the lighter shades of brown to those edges and pulling them outwards here. And some maybe higher in some points, but still, you know, really starting now to focus on the edges of pieces of fabric, and maybe some very selective high fold crease areas elsewhere on the coat. And now I've even changed my technique a bit. I'm doing the same thing, lightening from the edges inwards. I've added even more of the cork brown in here. In fact, I think this is almost pure cork brown, and I may even put a little bit of Iraqi sand in at this point. My brushing technique is different now, though. Instead of just kind of applying it and blending it like I was before. I'm now applying it and sort of using little fine, thin, kind of cross-hatchy strokes, or stippling, or some combination of the two. You kind of have to mix that up. You don't want to do all stippling or all cross-hatching. But you can see that I apply it to the edge and then sort of stipple and cross-hatch it kind of blotchily outward. And the effect that you generate by doing this is it makes like the leather look worn and uneven and like there's scratches on it. And so you kind of build it up heavily from at the edge where near the seams, and then as it goes inward you just have it sort of kind of fade out, and you'll want to, you know, have a few just lighter strokes in this color just kind of by themselves, even in some places on the dark surface here and there, just to simulate this wear or scratching or sort of uneven finish that you would expect to see on a leather garment like this. I continue that weathering now with a mix that's got a lot of Iraqi sand in the cork brown. And you can see now I'm really only applying in a very sort of fine line along the edges of the leather pieces, and then making lots of very fine light lines sort of going out from there that are sort of over top of the area that the larger sort of worn area that I've already painted. This color's so light, I'm not going to want to put too much of these stripes just out by themselves in the middle of a surface. They need to probably still stay in or near the edges of the fabric where everything is just generally more lighter and worn. You want to be a little bit careful with this. It's a lot of fun. It's easy to get carried away doing this, but if you do it too much, it's not going to look good, especially with these higher, lighter colors. So be careful not to, you know, overdo it. I mean, I even think I went in with some pure Iraqi sand in the end and used that just as at the very, very edges, just as a line too, to really get some extreme wear effects at the edge of the leather. But you want to be generally a little careful here, even though it'll be tempting to go on and on. Once you've gotten all that really light color in, you can then go back in with a very dark brown color and apply some sort of spots or kind of blotching lightly here and there, stippling kind of over the worn light areas to simulate that there's just some more unevenness in the color. If you do that, make sure you thin your paint down a lot. If it's too heavy, it won't look good, so you can kind of thinly apply some blotching with darker paints onto the worn areas that you just did. You can see here I'm doing that, I think, with some chocolate brown, just applying some dots. You may even want to go back over them once you've applied them with the light paint again, just to keep them from feeling too like prominent looking. The final thing I'm doing in that vein to help sort of unify those worn light areas is I am applying a wash of Agrex Earthshade specifically over the worn areas. This will warm it up a little bit, keep it from being too cool looking, and it'll also help bring back together and unify the darker brown with the lighter brown color. I'm now really going to quickly paint the shearling fleece collar on his coat. I'm just going to start out here by base coating this using dark sand. Nothing really tricky here. You might have to apply a couple coats to get good enough coverage over the black base coat, but other than that, you just want to make sure that you don't make a mess on the brown collar that you already painted. You may even want to go back in, I did, with some very dark brown to sort of define a sharp line between the fleece and the brown leather. Next, I'm going to highlight the fleece. First, I've got a mixture here of white and the dark sand, and I'm going to kind of overbrush the fleece area because I want to keep some of that yellowish color down in all of the recesses that are sculpted into the fleece. That'll, you know, because you want the wool to have sort of this warm kind of yellowish tone to it at its base. I'm going to do that. I'm going to overbrush it a couple times, and then I'm going to go back in again with just pure white this time and just further highlight it. Again, just overbrushing it so that we keep that sort of darker tone down in the sort of base of that furry area. Now I'm going to be working on his leather boots. I want them, they're going to be leather too, but I do want them to be a different shade or a different color than his coat. Nonetheless, I'm going to start out with the same German camouflage black-brown base coat on that area. My first highlight is the same too. I'm using chocolate brown here, and I'm gonna cover most areas. I'm just gonna kind of leave any sort of seams or dividing lines in the very dark brown, but everywhere else is gonna be coated with chocolate brown. I'll go back over some of the areas like the tops of his thighs and his toes and heels and stuff with an extra layer just to get a brighter, more intense effect on those pieces where you'd expect there to be a bit more light hitting. This is where I change how I paint the leather. Instead of, like with the jacket, where I mixed chocolate brown in with cork brown, I have now created a mixture that is chocolate brown and red leather. This first mixture, it's about 50-50, I guess. I don't know. So I'm going to start just layering that now over the boots. You can see I'm really starting to emphasize areas where light would be hitting on the boots. You can see underneath the thighs, I'm leaving darker and making sure all those lines where, you know, between pieces stay darker, and it's darker between his legs, all the logical places basically. So that's sort of my second highlight. Then I'm going to continue in that same way, but I'm just going to be using pure red leather, and I'm going to be applying it in the same way that I did the chocolate brown and red leather mix, but just now further starting to emphasize and pick out areas where light's hitting. You can see I'm going along sort of the edges of those sort of seams at the front of his boots, on his toes, sort of lining around the divide between the shoe and the sole of his boots. Kind of pretty logical places, pretty much. Again, just like with the jacket, I'm going to be trying to simulate heavier wear or sort of just a lightening effect along the edges of the leather pieces. And I'm doing this by taking that red leather and mixing some, again, cork brown into it to lighten it up. And you can see how I'm now kind of lining around all of the edges of the different pieces of leather. I'm blending it out where necessary, where, you know, where I think like the heels or the toes or things where I think it, you know, needs to be. And, you know, otherwise just using it sort of fine lining it where it's just sort of defining the seam. If you want, you can then build that up a little bit to get some, you know, brighter color. And then I finished off by taking just pure cork brown at the very end and using that very sparingly, very thinly, just very much on like the toes and some heels and some places where I wanted, you know, just that extra bright wear worn kind of look on the boots. Now I'm going to paint the areas of his uniforms that is actually showing under his coat, which basically just includes his pants and his hat. I'm going to be base coating those here using German camouflage extra dark green. This is about the same way I start when I'm painting World War II Germans as well. This is where things are going to get a little bit different from what I do with the World War II Germans. I would, for them, be using the German uniform field gray. Instead, on him, I'm using just a color that's called German uniform. It is a bit mintier and definitely a lot greener than the other shade, which is why I don't like it as much on the World War II Germans, though you did get this color occurring, especially sort of earlier war, but I find that it's just right for him. So I've got the paint pretty thin down here, and I'm just going to start layering it now, kind of over sort of the areas of highlight. His crease, there's a lot of very sharp creases, I should say, in his pants here, very deep, heavy creases. So you're going to have a lot of really, you know, stark contrast going on in that area. With his hat, you're really there's not much green area there's not a lot of folds, I guess, in the green area. So you're just really going to be kind of applying the paint there pretty straightforwardly, I guess. I'm then going to work on highlighting the green. by mixing some dark sand into the German uniform. This is a lot like the procedure I follow with the later World War II uniforms. It's really the only difference is I've switched out the shade of green that I'm using, but I'm applying the same base coat and I'm lightening the color basically in the same way. With that dark sand in there and that slightly lighter shade, I'm just going to start going back over and picking out the high sort of wrinkles and folds in the pants, as you'd expect, emphasizing the knees because you always want those brighter and lighter. And also, of course, on his hat, because it's, you know, a lot of light's going to be hitting there, you're going to want to make sure you get it nice and light on top of the hat. But especially as you go up and get to lighter shades, you probably want to define some sort of subtle wrinkles or variations in color there, just sort of very gradually as you add these highlights in. I recommend you just continue that process, making several more layers with just progressively larger quantities of the dark sand added in, and just keep defining and cleaning up the folds, particularly in his pants, which I found actually rather difficult to paint, just because the way they were sculpted, it made them kind of difficult to see where the high and low areas were, and it just got real messy. So, you know, you may need to, you know, really work on that. And you can see here how I have now started to find some slightly darker creases in the top of the hat, but they're still very, very subtle. And of course, around the edge, you're always just going to want to sort of make sure that's nice and light and bright. You can see I'm just really blending everything out up there. So, you know, just do this basically to your taste. Apply as many sort of lightening layers as you want to get a uniform color that you like. Now, his hat has a sort of a red band around it, and I'm going to paint that here first by base coating it with black red, and also then going ahead and highlighting it using Citadel Mephiston red, followed by Evil Sun Scarlet, real basic. The other thing is there was usually sort of a thin band of piping in red sort of around sort of the top the hat seam. I guess you can see how I'm painting it here. So I'm going to be picking that out. I'm going to use all the same colors to paint it. So starting with black, red, and then highlighting it as necessary. If you get the line a little uneven, you may need to go back in with your green, clean that up. Another thing I didn't show here, but I also ended up doing, which can help kind of define the difference between the red and the green, is to go back in with your base coat green, your German camouflage extra dark green, and run a really fine line around the sort of the edge of the red with that. That'll really help that red's band sort of pop out extra and sort of help separate it even better from just the normal lighter green color that you've got on the hat. Be sure to build up your reds here with at least several layers of each of the highlight colors, just because you want a nice, bright, brilliant kind of effect. At this point, there's just a few small details to paint. Right now I'm doing the sort of bill on his hat, which was sort of, I think, a very shiny black patent leather. So I'm base coating it in black. I'm also base coating the buttons on his coat in that color. And then I'm going to go ahead and highlight the bill of his hat just by making several shades of lighter gray here, by mixing sky gray into my black here. It's a small area, so you don't need to get overboard here, just and then slightly lightening out. And because this is supposed to be patent leather and therefore very shiny, I recommend you put some really thin line highlights of just pure sky gray or even white, just very thinly along them in one area. There's also two little sort of insignia on his hat. I'm base coating those in sky gray as well, and I'm using it to put a high, kind of shiny highlight on his buttons there real quick. I'll then highlight the insignia further with pure white, and then they're so small you can't really see what's going on, but then the sort of the bottom one contains a little tiny black circle, and the top one contains a little tiny red circle inside it. Okay, so here is our finished Red Baron figure. He's quite simple, but he's got some really interesting effects going on him. I think, namely, I think that leather jacket, which if you do well, will just look really spectacular. It's really going to be a focal point for the model, and I think in this case it succeeded really very nicely in, just really affecting how everything looks, and you really look at that. The uniform I think I was a little bit less successful with, but it looks okay. And again, because the jacket is really what you look at, the other areas, if they're not quite so strong, that's okay. As for achieving a likeness here, I don't know. I did my best, I'd say, with what I had to work with. As I said in the beginning, it's still going to really come down a lot to the quality of the sculpture, working with how much it looks like the figure to begin with, and then you can kind of, basically, you can never just purely influence a likeness here using paint alone. You've got to have a good basis to start from, and once you've got that, then you can kind of nudge it in one direction or the other a little bit with paint, you know, to help sort of, you know, increase the lightness and the effect. And as you can see, even when you don't necessarily have the best basis, you can still use the paint in some ways just to slightly, you know, at least bring it a little bit closer to how you want it to look, and, you know, just help to emphasize areas on the face that you think should be emphasized to make it look like a certain person, or de-emphasize areas that you think shouldn't be as defined as they are on that particular individual. Because, of course, here we can't see his full face, it's covered a lot by the hat. It makes it a little bit harder, too, to really guess how close the likeness is. So again, I hope you found this video useful, you enjoyed watching it. Please like it, share it with your friends. Do leave me a comment, as always, with what you thought. And of course, please do subscribe to my channel if you have not done so already. So that is all for this week, and I will see you next time.